In the last video, we discussed how to begin your painting. And you began with doing your field sketches, researching your plant, drawing and photographing, and getting the accurate color of your plant. So from here, let's talk about how do we start building up those bones to make an interesting composition. Now, I said in the last video too, I think it was the last video, that composition is both intellectual as well as intuitive. It involves both the mind and the heart. And you know, as we go through all of this stuff that we're going to be covering, you need to be constantly be thinking about how can I make my composition better? What is it going to take to make this better? What's the problem? What do I really like about this composition and I really want to riff with? You know, how is this, I think this composition's interesting, but how do I make it better? So it's, you know, it's partly the excitement and the joy that you can get once your composition starts falling together. And we'll be going over just exactly how to start feeling about how your heart's supposed to be feeling shortly. So just be aware of that as we move through this class. Now, generally, when you start thinking about, you know, you've got all your field sketches and photographs spread out all over your dining room table. Well, how do you pick from those what you're going to use? What you're going to start thinking about is finding your story, finding a intent. What do you want to intend the viewer to get from looking at your painting? Now, this could simply be the bite of an insect, you know, taking a chunk out of a leaf. It could also be the interior of a flower. This is not rocket science, and it's not difficult, but it can throw you for a loop as you're learning how to do it. But as you look through your photographs, what catches your eye? And that's something that, or let's see, the other thing to think about is what makes your heart leap. Because that's something that's telling you something. When you feel your heart leap, that's a fairly darn good indication that this is a direction you need to head in because it feels good. So be aware of how you're feeling as you're going through your photographs. Now, you want paintings can run the gamut from tickling people's fancy to something, you know, very solemn story about, you know, this plant is endangered or threatened. So that also could be something you play with as you're thinking, you know, you've done this research. Well, maybe something within the research sets off ideas for how can I use my photographs to tell the story of this endangered species and all the insects that are associated with it that are also going to suffer because this plant may disappear, and what happens to the ecosystem. So you want to have some kind of intent or story, because if you don't, and you don't really care, is your viewer going to care? And it's, you know, when you start getting into shows, if you want to get into shows or start trying to sell your art, you also have to be thinking about, you want to pull that viewer, that potential collector in to buy your painting. And if it's obvious that this is just a one-off, it doesn't necessarily going to pay off, and that your viewer is going to be very interested either. So think of that as well. And we'll cover this more later on in this video. But one of the things that you're going to be learning about is your center of interest and focal points. And a center of interest is where your eye stops. It's not a hard stop. You don't want it to be a dead stop, but you want it to be an area where the viewer pauses because it is so interesting. He must look at this some more. You can have additional focal points throughout your composition, which help also to help the eye move around a composition the way you want the viewer's eye to be moving through the composition. And use those focal points to help guide, and they're pauses. They're not strong stops. And we will be continuing to go through that. Well, we have a whole section in Center of Interest, and I'll certainly be happy to talk about this some more during office hours or during, after our group critique. So, if this is like, I don't understand this, please feel free to ask questions away, because I know this can be, from experience from teaching this, that it's hard to start learning what exactly makes a center of interest. Now, I know we've been talking about the subject matter and, having an intent. But when you actually start putting the pieces of the puzzles together, or start putting the bones together, your subject matter literally becomes like tertiary. I mean, it's way on down for putting together your composition, because what you're going to be wanting to look at are the relationships that are formed and harmonize between the subject's abstract shapes, values, and colors. It's these relationships that form by how they're placed adjacent to one another. This is the bones of your composition. Those working together, joyfully harmonizing with one another, this is what creates a good composition. Now, in addition to a good composition is, those shapes, that's looking at those positive shapes and negative spaces and how they're interacting together. It also involves having some type of boundary box, and we'll go over this some more, further on down, but having a boundary box, some kind of a frame where it's literally where the mat is going to be. You must get your mat, your positive, a line in for where your mat is, positive and negative spaces working together. Those positive and negative spaces don't work well at all until you get that mat in there. So it's important from the very, very beginning that you know what the size of your painting is, and you work through that and figure that out with thumbnail sketches. And we'll be covering thumbnail sketches in the next class. Let me look through my notes here, make sure I haven't skipped anything. So the unity that's in a painting, that makes a painting, it's almost like, and you'll see this once you start figuring it out, but when you go to the ASBA website and look at those fantastic paintings, you'll find that the abstract shapes, the elements, they fit together naturally. They belong together. There's no jarring element, and you can tell a jarring element is because your eye stops dead right there. It's like, what is that there for? What is its purpose? It's like having a wrong word in a sentence. It stops you dead because that word means nothing in here. What do they really mean? And that's exactly what can happen in a composition when you have something out of place. So you want a coherence between the subject, the spaces between the subject, and the color and the value.